Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll examine a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the killing today of Iran's top national security official and the head of the besieged militia, who were hiding in a safe house and were struck by Israel, opening the way for even more hardline officials to take over, since both Ali Laranjani and Brigadier General Soleimani were pragmatists in an otherwise radical regime of religious zealots. Joining us to discuss the historical record of U.S. meddling in Iran leading up to the current war is Tom Mockaitis, a professor of history at DePaul University, where he teaches courses in British, modern European and military history. His research and writing cover international security, terrorism, unconventional conflict and military history. A regular contributor to The Hill, he has taught counterterrorism courses at venues around the world as part of the U.S. Department of Defense's Counterterrorism Fellowship Program, and is the author of many books including New Terrorism, Myths and Reality, Violent Extremists Understanding the Domestic and International Terrorist Threat, and Iraq and the Challenge of Counterinsurgency. We'll discuss his article at The Hill, A History of U.S. Meddling in Iran Brought Us Here. Then we'll look into the intensifying war between Afghanistan's Taliban and their former sponsor Pakistan, following a strike on a drug rehabilitation hospital in Kabul that killed over 400. Joining us is Christine Fair, a professor in the Security Studies program within Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. She previously served as a political officer with the United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan in Kabul, and she's the author of Fighting to the End, The Pakistan Army's Way of War, and, in their own words, Understanding Lashkar-e-Taiba, and she speaks and reads Hindi, Urdu, and Punjabi. Then finally, with Trump claiming he will have, quote, the honor of taking Cuba and handpicking its new leader, we will speak with Luis Martinez-Fernandez, a professor of history at the University of Central Florida. He is an historian of Latin America and the Caribbean who focuses on the histories of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic. Born in Cuba, he is the author of a number of books including Revolutionary Cuba, A History, and we will discuss his expectation that the country will fall in a matter of weeks. And before we begin, with Trump having bombed 7 countries and started a war against Iran, while at home his ICE thugs terrorize and break up families, murdering American citizens in the process, the need to rid the country of the deeply unpopular Trump kakistocracy and his clown car cabinet could not be more urgent. But these crooks and criminals would do anything to stay in power, as their billionaire buddies buy up the mainstream media and the mob boss intimidates Republican politicians. Only people power can beat money power, and we need all hands on deck as we continue to do our part, delivering a daily public service, providing the facts and evidence to inform the majority of what they are up against and how to win back our country, our decency, and the respect of the community of nations. You can help save America's 250-year-old democracy by making a tax-deductible donation at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org, and thank you. And joining us now, Tom Mockaitis is a professor of history at DePaul University, where he teaches courses in British, modern European and military history. His research and writing cover international security, terrorism, unconventional conflict and military history. A regular contributor to The Hill, he has taught counterterrorism courses at venues around the world as a part of the United States Department of Defense's Counterterrorism Fellowship Program, and he's the author of many books including New Terrorism, Myths and Reality, Violent Extremists Understanding the Domestic and International Terrorist Threat, and Iraq and the Challenge of Counterinsurgency. And he has an article at The Hill, A History of U.S. Meddling in Iran Brought Us Here. Welcome to Background Briefing, Tom Mockaitis.
Thank you.
So just in terms of today's headlines, Tom, of course, the Israelis struck and killed Ali Laranjani, Iran's top national security official, and they also the head of the besieged militia, Brigadier General Soleimani. They were hiding out in a safe house that the Israelis struck. But, of course, what's not in the headline is that these two characters were relative, I guess, pragmatists in this otherwise radical regime of religious zealots. So, again, if you kill the pragmatists, all you're left with are the hardliners, and there seems to be a lot of redundancy there.
Well, that should have been expected. Like so many other things about this whole operation, is it wasn't thought through because the previous leader was in his 80s and he perfectly knew perfectly well not only that he was up in years and in failing health, but that he had a bullseye on his forehead. So he had a succession plan A, B, C, and probably D. And I'm sure they have that as well. And exactly right. This now, according to some experts, this war has given a breath of life to the more hardline members of the regime, when before that they were losing credibility and ground. So, there was so much, it's not clear what the end state here is or what the goals are.
Right. And when you talk about hardline, these are religious fanatics who,
Right.
who send notes down the well talking to the 12th Imam. So they're going to fight to the bitter end. Is there anything everybody I've talked to, Tom, says, people who know the region, speak the language, and understand military and foreign policy issues, that everybody says this is a disaster from day one. Do you see any light at the end of the tunnel?
Not a whole lot. And to add what you said about the religion, it's also a religious subculture that values martyrdom. So the idea of fighting to the death is not a concept that's foreign to them. No, I think, the Times had a good article, a day or so ago saying that the president has two choices, neither one of which is appealing. He can try and continue to fight this to the bitter end, but there's no clear evidence as to what the end will be, and erode support for it at the war, which is very low even now. Or he can, in fact, try to declare victory and look for an off ramp, in which case Iran manages to keep whatever it still has by way of its nuclear program and will declare a kind of victory. So it doesn't look very good, and we seem to be sinking deeper into it. Now we've sent over a Marine contingent that they're talking about seizing the oil depot island. Well, what is that going to do? And bombing it, what does it do? Okay, it restricts Iran's ability to export, but it takes more oil out of the international market, which causes the price to go up.
Well, Tom, there's a story that hasn't gotten much coverage, but the USS Gerald Ford, the largest
Fire. Yeah.
largest warship in the U.S. Navy, it's on its way to join in the Abraham Lincoln off Yemen to join in this war. Apparently, this is extraordinary, and I need to get some more reporting on it, but this is what I've been told, that the crew, they've been afloat now for months and months on end, way past the normal rotation, and then they got
Yeah.
dragged into this war. And it looks as if the crew sabotaged the plumbing to the point that the toilets are all backed up, and it's even on the flight deck covered with feces. That's pretty amazing.
Well, the other thing I've heard too, and I was not aware of just that particular story, but there was a fire in the laundry room. And it took quite a bit of time. And now, on top of what you've just said, you've got, something like, I think they said about 600 bunks destroyed. So you've got people, sleeping wherever they can on the floor, on tables, whatever. So, yeah, I mean, that raises, serious questions, about its readiness. And the other concern, that I've had, and not just me, but a lot of military experts, is that we are repositioning a disturbing percentage of our assets to the region, and we are burning through ordnance at an alarming rate, particularly the Tomahawk cruise missiles, to the point where you wonder, would we have enough for a contingency in other areas should one arise?
So this indicates that the war is already not so much come home, but it's striking at our military itself. If
Yeah.
the sailors aboard the Gerald Ford are so tired of being on this endless rotation without shore break, and entering another war that they, I don't know how they feel about it, but I mean, if I was in the military, I would not be very confident in our commander in chief, who doesn't seem to deal with reality.
Well, and the other thing about the Ford, they're deploying it in the Caribbean for the Venezuelan operation was for show. I mean, this is a president who likes a great dramatic gestures, and the largest of everything. So deploying and saying, this is the largest aircraft carrier in the fleet, and look what I can do with it. Seems to, I've said on numerous occasions, trying to look for strategic logic in a lot of what we've seen over the last year is very problematic because so many of the responses seem to be driven by the president's ego, the whims of the moment, and whoever he's talked to last.
So, Tom, let's talk about your article at The Hill, A History of U.S. Meddling in Iran, brought us here. Of course, I guess historians will go back to Mossadegh, who was a relatively mild and moderate socialist. I think you could probably compare him to Bernie Sanders. He was hardly a threat. But in those days, in 1952, you still had the last throes of the British Empire and the emergence of the American Empire. So the empire struck back, right?
Yes, and it's also, he threatened international economic interests by trying to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian oil company, which ultimately the Shah did, but he had to cut a 50-50 deal with investors, and as you and I were talking about before we came on, the Americans wanted in on that, and they got in on that. This is also the same decade in which the CIA was behind a plot to remove the president of Guatemala because his dealings were not liked by the fruit company. And so this was the depth of the Cold War, and these kinds of things, happened, and we put the Shah in place. And as in the same in Africa and Asia, we would work with dictators who were anti-communist, and that came back to bite us pretty hard, and it bit us in the form of Khomeini, the Ayatollah, and the Islamic Revolution of 1979.
And of course, Khomeini succeeded Khomeini, and these people are on a different planet, and they've got who knows what the percentage is. Apparently, the majority of the people just absolutely hate this government, particularly after it mowed down thousands of them in recent protests. But these are the very people that we should be helping. But as far as I can tell, we're going to hang them out to dry. Trump already did that in the last go-round, where he promised them that to rise up against their government. And then, he said, if the government kills you, I'm locked and loaded.
Yeah.
Well, the government killed him, and he didn't do a damn thing. So I can't see why the Iranian people would want to take to the streets when they've already been told by their government, if they take to the streets, you'll be considered Israeli soldiers and you'll be shot down.
Well, and exactly. I was on a panel discussion on a talk show here with an Iranian American scholar who said that, is from the region actually, and said that and the population of around 90 million, maybe 8 to 10 million support the regime. But as is the case in Venezuela, the regime controls the instruments of oppression and power. And just as when the president removed Maduro from Venezuela, we did not see democracy pop up like a tulip in a spring rain, because unless you're willing to go in with boots on the ground, which we weren't, it was the same old under a different name. Now the vice president had the good sense to to do what Trump wanted economically, but to stay in power. And I think it's hard to see a different outcome for Iran. And the other thing is, even if by some miracle the regime would be overthrown, there's this naive assumption that we have, a unified country with a unified opposition. This is a deeply divided, ethnically, religiously, politically, in every which way country. And what you will have in all probability is what we had when we invaded Iraq. Take out the strongman and you have chaos.
Well, that appears to be perfectly okay with Netanyahu. It seems that the Israelis just want to pound them and pay them back for October 7th and years of sponsoring surrogate proxies that have attacked them like Hezbollah. So
I think there's a little more to Netanyahu's agenda. I think the intensity of Israeli strikes is perhaps because they know that Trump is so mercurial, he could pull the plug at any minute. And they may remember that when they tried to strike at the leadership that was in the Gulf, Trump, who had investments there, very quickly shut that down. And I think so. They think they realize they don't know how long they'll be able to do this. They do want to degrade Iran to the point where it's not a threat, and they want to eliminate the nuclear capability. But the other piece of the puzzle is it is in Netanyahu's best interest politically to keep the war going, because he then is allowed to stay in power. He can appear as the strong man in the next election. I keep you safe. He staves off questions about why did you let October 7th happen in the first place? And then of course he is trying desperately to get out of the criminal case he's involved in. And Trump has been pressuring the president of Israel to pardon him and has not been able to do that.
So what's going on with the Gulf countries? Because there have been reports, and maybe it's just the citizenry that are furious about being hit, but maybe some of the political leaders as well. There was a quote from one of the billionaires from Dubai, I think it was, saying, we spent all this money on buying American arms, and we've been, not to mention, giving lots of money to Trump and his family, and this is what we get in return. So you hear that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you also hear reports, for example, that Trump talks regularly to Mohammed bin Salman on the phone, and MBS is urging Trump to finish the job and take out the Iranian regime. And there's also reports that is also echoes what other Gulf leaders are saying. So what's the real story here? Do you know, Tom?
I wouldn't be the least bit surprised by that, because the Iranians and the Saudis have been fighting a proxy war in Yemen for several years. This is to some degree, Shia Sunni Islam, but also, going back before that, Arab Persian, kind of a struggle. And so, yeah, I'm sure he does want them to do that. None of these states have particularly robust militaries. They may have some air defense capability, but you may recall during the first Gulf War, they did deploy some Saudi units just mainly for show, and they didn't prove capable much. It relies very heavily on its wealth to buy its protection. And, they're being hit because they have U.S. military bases and U.S. ties. And Iran, I don't defend what they're doing, ethically, but in terms of strategy, it's pretty shrewd. They're making the most of the limit, what they have in a very asymmetrical war.
Right, and the three U.S. F-15s that were shot down, they were shot down by a Kuwaiti pilot, and replacement costs for them are $90 million a copy. So that's almost
but that's because we didn't, as I understand it, we didn't share intelligence with the Kuwaitis, so that they didn't deconflict the airspace or weren't aware that we were doing the overflight. I mean, from A to Z, this whole thing has been pretty cobbled together. And it's inexcusable, because as I read the tea leaves, it was abundantly clear that Trump had no intentions of negotiating a settlement. And quite literally, up to the day before the attacks began, the negotiators emerged, not merely, the Iranian, but also the Omani intermediary, saying that they were making progress. But there was no real intention of letting that go, of letting that happen. And what's interesting, too, is that, we're already seeing the president's attention start to wander, because he's now making noises about Cuba. They're so weak, I can do whatever I want. This is, it's a very disturbing way to conduct foreign and defense policy.
Right, and on top of that, of course, one of the first things that happened in this current war was 170 plus schoolgirls were killed by a U.S. Tomahawk that was, a wrong target thanks to AI and out-of-date intel. So,
well, not just that. There's a more insidious explanation. There was an Office of Civilian, Casualty Mitigation, I'm not sure that's the exact title, in the Pentagon. And I talked to some of the people who were involved in fighting ISIS. They explained how they went to great lengths to survey targets and avoid civilian casualties. And, Hegseth gutted that, took about 90% of the people out. And the stories now are that you got a couple of people sitting at desks occupying the office merely because he's not allowed to actually abolish it because that would require congressional action. But we really took out the capability to do target assessment from a point of view of, avoiding civilian casualties. But Hegseth is committed to maximum lethality, and he, has indicated he really doesn't care much about those things.
Right, and then of course today we're learning that the head of counterintelligence has quit, blaming the war on Israel, although he's got some far-right sort of neo-Nazi sympathy, so I'm not sure he's the most credible source. What do you think?
No. Well, no, I have not dug into that story, so I can't really comment on it in any kind of detail. But that is something I wish the resignation thing. For example, the commander of Southcom, resigned over the attacks on the ships in the Caribbean, the boats in the Caribbean. But what you expect to happen after a resignation from a high-ranking military officer is that they now use their credibility and their status to speak out. Because the minute you take the uniform, when you're in uniform, you're not allowed to offer opinions on politics, and certainly not to criticize the commander in chief. But once you hang the uniform up, you have that ability. And I would argue that if there's to some degree a moral obligation to do that.
Well, let's hope that happens, and still go back to the first Trump administration. And I still wish that Mattis and Kelly and McMaster and others had been more robust in their criticism of how Trump was so dangerously out of his depth. But that's a conversation for another day, and I thank you for joining us, Tom.
Sure, happy to do it. Have a nice day.
You too. And again, I've been speaking with Tom Mockaitis, who's a professor of history at DePaul University, where he teaches courses in British, modern European, and military history. His research and writing cover international security, terrorism, and unconventional conflict, and military history. A regular contributor to The Hill, he has taught counterterrorism courses at venues around the world as a part of the United States Department of Defense's Counterterrorism Fellowship Program, and is the author of many books, including New Terrorism, Myths and Reality, Violent Extremists, Understanding the Domestic International Terrorist Threat, and Iraq and the Challenge of Counterinsurgency. And he has an article at The Hill, A History of U.S. Meddling in Iran Brought Us Here. Now, we're going to take a brief station break and back looking into the intensifying war between Afghanistan's Taliban and their former sponsor, Pakistan.
He turned up to get a job and showed he wasn't scared. Swapped by sky had the handicap, he thought he'd be prepared. At the age of 17, he was forced to choose. At the age of 21, he's in catch-22. At the age of 17, how was he to know?
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Christine Fair, who is a professor in the Security Studies program within Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. She previously served as a political officer with the United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan in Kabul, and she's the author of Fighting to the End, the Pakistan Army's Way of War, and In Their Own Words, Understanding Lashkar-e-Taiba, and she speaks and reads Hindi, Urdu, and Punjabi. Welcome to Background Briefing, Christine Fair.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And Chris, we've spoken over the years, or I guess in terms of the U.S. war in Afghanistan over the decades. And for the longest time, you were suggesting that if this war ever ended, the first thing that would happen is that the Taliban, Afghan Taliban, would turn on their sponsor, the Pakistani army and the ISI. So it's happening, but why is it happening?
So there's the long answer, and then there's the short answer. The long answer goes to the fact that Pakistan has always had problems with Afghanistan going back to the earliest days of Pakistan's independence. The Afghans reject the border, which they call the Durand Line, which the Pakistanis believe to be the international border. The Afghans interfered in Balochistan as well as in what was then called the NWFP. And that really drove Pakistan to manipulate Afghanistan, to interfere in Afghan affairs, to try to create a regime in Kabul that would be favorable to Pakistan's interests. So that's the historical answer. But the short-term answer is the following. After Pakistan agreed to help the United States in its war in Afghanistan, albeit with great problems, there was a series of militant group defections, militant groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed that used to be allied to the Pakistani state that actually began turning, elements within those groups began turning against the Pakistani state. And in 2007, they came together under the umbrella of the Tehreek-e-Taliban-e-Pakistan, aka the Pakistani Taliban. Since the emergence of the Pakistani Taliban, there have been about 75,000 fatalities in Pakistan. Most of those fatalities are due to strikes from the Pakistani Taliban. They had been quiescent for a number of years thanks to U.S. drone strikes that really did much to do, that was engaging in considerable leadership decapitation, and also because of Pakistan's own counterinsurgency efforts, which were really quite brutal in the tribal areas in particular. So they were quiescent until the Afghan Taliban came back to power in 2021, and they came back roaring. The problem is that the Pakistani Taliban have sanctuary in Afghanistan. And the Pakistanis are really exhausted with the Afghan Taliban giving sanctuary to the Pakistani Taliban. And that's kind of where we are right now. So in some sense, Pakistan is being forced to eat the fruits of its own policies.
And the Pakistani Taliban, the TTP, they were behind the 2012 attack on the then schoolgirl Malala, who received the Nobel Peace Prize.
Correct.
So let's talk about what just happened, this bombing of what the Taliban in Afghanistan are claiming to be a drug rehabilitation hospital. But the Pakistani authorities are saying they targeted military installations supporting terrorist groups and infrastructure. So what's the truth, if we can find one?
Well, it's very difficult without having international reporters in Afghanistan. And for reasons that are obvious, we really don't have those. But we do have a couple of sources on the ground. The Norwegian Refugee Council, I believe is what it's called, it actually went to the site. It confirmed that it was, in fact, the Omid recovery facility. Omid means hope. So basically this addiction recovery facility. So they confirmed that this was in fact the addiction recovery center that was targeted. The Pakistanis claimed that there was a secondary explosion, which confirms their contestation that this was a training facility. But video footage that was provided to CBS News, in fact, shows no such secondary explosion. So right now, it looks as if the preponderance of evidence, such as it is, really lies with the Taliban claims that this was a rehabilitation hospital that was hit. The numbers that the Taliban claim are about 400 people killed, 250 injured. Those numbers will naturally change as the bodies in the rubble are still being retrieved. And it obviously, there could be survivors, but there could also be more fatalities retrieved from that rubble. But right now, it looks as if the Afghans are more likely right than not.
So how do you think the Afghan people feel about being bombed by their former sponsor and neighbor? I mean, I guess, are they just immune to violence, having been subject to violence for decades?
No, let me tell you, whenever I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan prior to the return of the Taliban in 2021. If you ever asked an Afghan and I did this, you ask an Afghan who their enemy is, to a man and a woman, they would say Pakistan, because they know that it has been Pakistan that has been interfering in their affairs, going back as early as 1973, when Zulfikar Ali Bhutto organized Islamist dissidents fleeing Dowd's regime and organized them into so-called mujahideen groups that he reinserted back into Afghanistan. To a man or a woman, Afghans say their true enemy is Pakistan. I remember I was at the military training academy in Kabul back in 2009, and I asked young recruits into the Afghan army, who is your enemy? To a man, they said Pakistan.
So why didn't the US recognize this? And what should they have done, do you think? Because they never really seemed to I'm sure they were aware how much Pakistan was behind supplying, for example, the ANFO that killed or blew the limbs off so many Americans. Was there a missed opportunity there if the attitude of the average Afghan was that the number one enemy is Pakistan, not the Americans? It feels as though maybe the Americans dropped the ball.
So, as you know, because we've discussed this countless times going back to 2001, the Americans were in a war that they could never win because they were logistically dependent upon Pakistan. The vast majority of the war material going into Afghanistan either passed through Pakistani ground lines of communication, which is to say principally road links, or Pakistan's airspace. There was this so-called northern distribution route, and it never accounted for more than 20% of the logistic throughput into Afghanistan. And because of Russia, no lethal goods could be carried through the northern distribution route. So the U.S. was in this pickle. It chose to fight a war for which it had no ability to win because it was reliant upon a partner that was singularly devoted to undermining the interests of the United States. So I remember talking to Theo Farrell, who is one of the foremost scholars of the NATO war in Afghanistan. And we were in resounding agreement that what the United States should have done was ousted the Taliban, focused upon getting Al-Qaeda, and then gotten the hell out, because there was no way that the U.S. could have sustained a war to victory when it was so dependent upon the airspace and the ground space of such a duplicitous partner as Pakistan was.
So, given that history that you've just outlined, at this point, what is the attitude that the U.S. has? Have they just washed their hands of this whole sorry episode? Are they involved in any way? Is anybody mediating this dispute? Obviously, Pakistan has a military edge here, but, I wonder at some point whether or not anybody will stop this, or alternatively, will it escalate? If the average Afghan considers Pakistan their number one enemy, this thing could escalate, surely.
So I don't think there's any off-ramps right now. The Chinese have offered to intervene, and Pakistan doesn't seem interested. Pakistan really wants to clobber the Afghan Taliban into getting them to cease and desist, giving sanctuary and training to the Pakistani Taliban. The U.S., as far as I can tell, has not offered to intervene. It has nothing to offer in that regard. The Chinese have really close ties with the Taliban, and they have close ties to Pakistan. So the Chinese are a natural interlocutor. But from what I can tell, the U.S. has reaffirmed Pakistan's right to self-defense, which would mean that it seems to be supporting Pakistan's what it calls total war in Afghanistan. You have to remember that after Operation Sindoor back in May, there was a tremendous rapprochement between the Trump administration and Pakistan's Field Marshal Asim Munir. The Pakistanis very early understood how to work the Trump regime. Even before Operation Sindoor, they held up this guy that it claimed to be the mastermind of the Abbey Gate mass murder. There's no evidence that he was actually the mastermind of this. He seems to be a low-level ISIS operator. He was a chicken farmer. The Pakistanis also then bought into the cryptocurrency scam of Trump's sons. Which is, as you know, no one invests in those cryptocurrency scams because they expect a return on their investment. It's basically pay to play. And then after Operation Sindoor, the Pakistanis thanked Trump for his efforts to bring about peace, said that he saved millions of lives and he diverted nuclear war. The Indians rebuffed this, which is responsible for the schism between the Trump administration and India. So right now, the relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan seems to be on the mend, and the U.S. seems to be supporting Pakistan's alleged right to defend itself.
And this all is about stroking Trump's ego, right? If you say you're the great hero that ended the possibility of a nuclear war between Pakistan and India, whereas Modi, the Prime Minister of India, didn't want to agree to that script.
Correct.
This is childish, isn't it? I mean,
it's childish. And also Pakistan nominated Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. So
right.
all of these, I call this the politics of Chaploosi. Chaploosi is an Urdu word which means bum kissing.
I see. Well, Trump has a rather large orange bum, I must say. So
and lots of people lining up to kiss it.
That's for sure. So how much is this current war, U.S.-Israel war on Iran, rattling the neighborhood?
So that's an interesting question. It's rattling the neighborhood. Both India and Pakistan are dependent upon petroleum products that pass through the Strait of Hormuz. India gets about 80% of its petroleum from the Strait of Hormuz, about 40% of its liquefied natural gas product coming from the Strait of Hormuz. Pakistan actually surprisingly doesn't get that much, even though it's a neighbor of Iran. It doesn't get that much of its petroleum products from Iran directly, but about 17 or so percent comes from Balochistan through illegal channels. So both are pretty rattled because both are pretty dependent upon fuel that goes through the Strait of Hormuz. My friends in India report that they're having a lot of difficulties getting LPG canisters for cooking. You know, most Indians cook from gas canisters if they are, unless they're living in a village where they'll use cow dung, for example. So it's really pushing both countries' fuel storage. It's in terms of foreign policy, India is in a crunch because India has maintained cordial diplomatic relations with Iran. Obviously, the U.S. it's a little bit under strain, but also Israel. And you might recall that the United States sunk an Iranian frigate coming back from conducting exercises in India, which was incredibly humiliating for India. The U.S., in complete violation of international law, refused to help the survivors of the ship leaving the Sri Lankans to do the rescue operations. So this has put the Indians in a really tough place geopolitically, as well as with regards to its energy supplies.
And that's our macho strutting Secretary of Defense, right? Hegseth. That's his lethality, his war on the woke. We just kill a bunch of Iranian sailors. I believe the ship was actually unarmed because it
was unarmed. Well, there's a little bit of dispute about whether it was completely unarmed or mostly unarmed, as because of the terms of the exercise that it was engaging in. It had to be mostly unarmed. So there's a little bit of dispute whether it was completely unarmed or simply mostly unarmed. But yes, I mean that's an important point to note.
Right. So what about the border area between Afghanistan and Iran? During that war, there were some tensions there, wasn't there? During the Afghan war between Iran and Afghanistan. So, is there any spillover from this war?
Not really. No.
Right. So, just in closing, then, you're there in Washington, and I know you know a lot of strategists. I've not talked to anybody that said anything but this is a total catastrophe, this war on Iran. Nobody's been able to say that either, I mean, maybe the Israelis will obtain their objectives because they'll weaken and divide and ruin Iran as much as they can. But in terms of a day after and some kind of stability, nobody's told me that this is anything but a catastrophe. Is there anybody that you've talked to, Chris, that would indicate that any of these objectives will be met?
I mean, I would say Zionists are very enthusiastic about this war because of the reasons that you noted. It's also giving them cover to continue to prosecute. It's giving Israel cover to prosecute their annexation of southern Lebanon. Israel's been very clear that it intends to annex territory in southern Lebanon as well as Syria. It's also been very clear about the continuation of what the world calls the genocide in Gaza and ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. So I think Israel is going to meet its objectives. The Iranian regime is going to be weakened. It gives them cover to prosecute really noxious policies in its immediate neighborhood. But I think the U.S. is going to be we're going to come out of this with some badly bruised.
But Trump will nevertheless declare victory, right?
Well, we have to remember George W. Bush back in 2004 declaring victory in Iraq. So you can declare all the victory that you want. It doesn't mean that it's victorious. Well,
Chris Fair, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you.
And again, I've been speaking with Christine Fair, who's a professor in the Security Studies program within Georgetown University at Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. She previously served as a political officer with the United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan in Kabul, and is the author of Fighting to the End, the Pakistan Army's Way of War, and in their own words, Understanding Lashkar-e-Taiba, and she speaks and reads Hindi, Urdu, and Punjabi. We're going to take a brief station break, back looking into Trump's claim that he will, quote, have the honor of taking Cuba and hand-picking its new leader as the country appears to be ready to fall within a matter of weeks. Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Luis Martinez-Fernandez, who is a professor of history at the University of Central Florida. He's an historian of Latin America and the Caribbean who focuses on the histories of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic. He was born in Cuba and is the author of a number of books, including Revolutionary Cuba, A History. Welcome to Background Briefing, Luis Martinez-Fernandez.
Thank you, Ian. My pleasure to join you again.
Well, thanks for joining us, Luis. And do you think that in terms of revolutionary Cuba, the revolution is sort of grinding to a halt, just like the lights are going out?
Well, the revolution, I believe, ended a long time ago. Some claim as far back as 1970. But as far as the regime, I think we're talking weeks now.
So Trump's precondition is that Miguel Diaz-Canel, the president, has to give up power, and Trump gets to decide who the next leader of Cuba is. This is like, Luis, it's like a reality TV show, judging the contestants. I get to choose. I mean, it's unbelievable that this president behaves this way, but his career, of course, comes out of reality TV, so...
That is true. I agree that Diaz-Canel must come out, but I disagree with the fact that Cuba's next president gets to be selected by an American president. That's not a good way to start post-regime Cuba.
So on Monday, Trump said, I do believe that I have the honor of taking Cuba. Whether I free it, take it, think I could do anything I want with it, you want to know the truth? They're a very weakened nation right now. So this is who we have. This guy, drunk, giddy with power, clearly megalomaniacal. But meanwhile, he's got us into a disastrous war in Iran. So do you think that he's now casting about for some good news, a quick little victory against a country that's been so weakened that it's barely, breathing?
Well, yes, the country has been weakened, of course, economically. On that subject, it has come to a virtual standstill. I've never seen anything even remotely close to a country imploding economically. The regime has been weakened. To begin with, Miguel Diaz-Canel and company are not popular at all. They don't have the revolutionary credentials of the so-called historic generation, and they're flaunting their wealth and their power, them and their children, their grandchildren. This is something new. So I believe universally we want him out. And the people of Cuba, although they do not get to express their opinion through public opinion polls and the like, they want him out too.
So Jim Hines, who's on the House Intelligence Committee, he's one of the 8 that get briefed on important issues. He recently said that a lot of the leadership in Cuba will want to join their Swiss bank accounts. How much have these guys feathered their own nests, and how much could that be used as a way, as an enticement for them to retire?
Well, the Miami Herald published some news stories about a year and a half ago about the fact that we're talking in the billions. This is money belonging to the high-ranking military. So that money is out there. It's money that was stolen from the Cuban economy and the Cuban people. I don't think they should get to keep it, but if having that abroad and accessible to them is a way of getting them out, I'm all for it.
Right, and that's the military foundation or corporation that basically runs the economy, and they've invested something like, what, $25 billion in building hotels, etc. So who controls all that money?
Well, right now, the military. Decades ago, Raul Castro was examining ways, this was actually in the aftermath of the cleansing of the military that occurred in 1989. And he came up with this scheme to keep the military loyal to the regime. And what he did was that he gave important economic appointments to members of the high brass, whether it be controlling a hotel chain or different corporations, state-run corporations, and therefore they have that sort of connection with the regime. But when these things happen, Ian, things turn on a dime, and those who are loyal today may be disloyal tomorrow.
Well, I think our solidarity, surely, Luis, has to be with the Cuban people, just as it should be with the Iranian people who are being bombed in the name of being liberated. And I'm wondering what the U.S. policy is, in terms of Cuba. Is they're being starved in order to be liberated? Is that the difference between being in Iran and being in Cuba?
Yes, they're being starved. And of course, the Trump administration has tightened the screws with the total pressure. But they're also starving because the Cuban government does not have the funds, the hard currency to purchase foodstuffs. It's they're doing in large measure what we're seeing now is an acceleration of those pressures. But yes, the United States is pushing them. Marco Rubio, of course, has very personal reasons for doing this. Trump's reasons always have to do with something other than ideology. They mostly have to do with opening Cuba to large influxes of U.S. capital.
So you're in touch with Cuba. I've anecdotally, we tried to talk to a reporter down there for Reuters, but the electricity goes out. So, it's hard to arrange a Zoom when your computer batteries are drained. You know what I mean? It's been tough to get a first-hand account. There are some reporters down there. But what are you hearing? Because I understand it's just really disastrous. Garbage is piling up in the streets. Cars and motorcycles that are abandoned on the side of the road, having run out of gas. What kind of imagery are you hearing, and what kind of anecdotal stuff have you heard?
Yes, there's plenty of footage in the internet that shows the Cuban people protesting. Now, protests began to intensify at the beginning of this year. The fuel crisis, of course, had a lot to do with that. Food scarcities, water scarcities. But I will say that over the last 10 days or so, what I've been watching are massive protests, not in the dozens of people, but hundreds of people at night in different parts of the island. One of the most glaring cases occurred in the municipality of Holguín, of Morón, I should say, where protesters set on fire the headquarters of the local Communist Party. That's unheard of. And we see that every single night. We see that in municipality after municipality. And I'm talking about a spontaneous protest. This is not organized, as they would like to claim. These are people who are desperate, no electricity, very little food, almost no running water, and they're desperate, and their chant is libertad, libertad. They want freedom.
But what about Marco Rubio and the Cuban Americans who have always been a powerful lobby? They're been given enormous amounts of resources, and recently some of these characters, like the Brothers to the Rescue, sent speedboats in there full of arms. That seems to be the worst kind of response to this humanitarian crisis. Is there any indication that the U.S. will have a more enlightened approach to helping the Cuban people in this moment of dire need?
As far as the U.S. government, I'm not that optimistic. The Cuban exile community is large. There's some hardliners, but then they're reasonable people. I count myself among them, who really want a better life for the Cuban people, and they want a democracy. Others, unfortunately, as you mentioned, they're interested in investing and extracting out of Cuba. We had that. We had that at the beginning of the 20th century with U.S. intervention. It didn't work out well. Remember, those places where the United States intervened militarily in the first 2, 3 decades of the 20th century, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, of course, Cuba, these were precisely the countries that the United States left a mess in large measure, and then had to re-intervene during the 1950s and the 1960s and well into the 80s. So we don't want that repeated. We want respect for the Cuban people, for the dignity. Some are saying that Marco Rubio should be the next president. Of course not. The next president should be elected by the Cuban people, and it should be a Cuban from the island who has lived through all of this. Nobody from the United States should be in the leadership after what happens.
So, Luis, you're expecting the regime to fall in about a week or so. Walk us through that scenario. Obviously there'll be an exodus of the people that have got Swiss bank accounts, etc. But how's this going to work out? And at what point, there'll be a temptation on the part of the U.S. to send boots on the ground. I'm pretty sure that that's what Marco Rubio and company have up their sleeve. What do you think? I mean, obviously there should be an invasion of aid workers and humanitarians. That's the people that should be storming the country, not a bunch of American soldiers.
I agree. That went wrong before. We don't want that to happen again. Now, I didn't say a week. I said it's a matter of weeks. And I firmly believe that that's the case because of the desperation. Now, I've been seeing footage of the Cuban leadership, the same people who sported their inflated bellies because they're very, very well fed, the arrogance that they had been displaying for the last few months. Now we see fear in their faces. They're afraid of their end. And as far as troops on the ground, that would be disastrous for the United States.
But what about the Cuban military themselves? Obviously, the top guys have all got incredibly rich off the system that they've created, where their companies, basically, the military runs all of the sort of capitalist institutions. What about rank and file? Is there any possibility? They must be suffering along with their fellow citizens.
That is very true. Because the regime used to have resources to distribute to the loyalists. Now those resources are gone. Now, I don't think for a minute that if the brass leaves, that the lower ranking military personnel is going to fight by itself. I mean, there's no reason for that to happen. I don't think it would.
So is there an exit plan, do you think, for the elite to leave, and then you just have a huge vacuum? And as I say, that's when I get nervous about U.S. intervention, hoping, of course, that it would be humanitarian as opposed to military.
What I would like to see, maybe that's what happens, is a joint civilian military junta that sort of runs the government before a period of elections, which could happen in a few months, perhaps a year. So I do anticipate that there's a transition that is peaceful. The more level heads will prevail, and we will avoid a bloodshed in Cuba or civil war.
But what about the Canadians? Can they get involved? Because the Cuban people love the Canadians. They don't trust the Americans, from what I understand. And, of course, you've got the influence of the hard right Cuban exile community in South Florida. As you say, it's not monolithic, but nevertheless, they haven't been particularly helpful so far. Do you think there's a role for other countries like Canada?
Well, I don't think so under the Trump administration. What I see a little bit, and that's already beginning to happen, is the Vatican playing some sort of a role. But the United States has not been kind to Canada. Threats of turning Canada into the 51st state of the Union, that's offensive. And I don't see the Trump administration working with Canada towards any goal in Cuba. The Canadians would, and they would, be good at it. But I don't see the Trump administration enlisting them anytime soon.
So just in closing then, Luis, that's the problem, right? That one way or other, Trump is going to decide, even though, as we pointed out, it's so insulting, the idea that I get to choose the next leader of Cuba.
Yes, it's very insulting. And the other factor still up in the air is that we don't know how the war in Iran will end, whether it will end in a couple of weeks, a month or so. That's still up in the air. And it is a very unpopular war, meaning that an invasion of Cuba would be even more unpopular.
Well, that won't stop them because they like to change the headlines, That's what reality TV is all about. A different headline every day.
It's maddening just to keep track of it, Ian.
Well, I thank you for joining us here today, Luis.
Thank you very much.
Again, I've been speaking with Luis Martinez-Fernandez, who is a professor of history at the University of Central Florida. He's an historian of Latin America and the Caribbean who focuses on the histories of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic. He was born in Cuba and is the author of a number of books, including Revolutionary Cuba, A History. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another background briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
By 9:30.